submit questions throughout the webinar in the Q&A button to me, and I'll receive those and bring it back to the audience. We have 75 minutes for this discussion with our three illustrious panelists. And so I think we have plenty of time to take questions from you. The topic of discussion, now that the dust has settled on the Iran-Israeli war of last month, at least settled a bit, I think we're going to examine some of the implications of that war, specifically for the Gulf region, which was a bit overlooked as the kind of main focus of attention last month was on the conflict, and its main parties, Iran, Israel, and the United States. So we want to look at some of the implications and widen the lens a bit. And for this discussion, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Mahjoub Zouairi, who is a professor of the contemporary politics and history of the Middle East at Qatar University. He's also a specialist on Iran and Arab-Iranian relations and has authored numerous publications on the subject over his career. And he's a senior non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council. We also have Dr. Dania Thafer, who's the executive director of the Gulf International Forum in Washington, D.C., and a professorial lecturer at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. And she's also a senior non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council. And we have Rashid Al-Muhannadi, who's a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council, and he works in the defense industry in the Gulf, and will bring that type of defense and security lens to this conversation. So just to kind of recap a little bit of what happened over 12 days last month and set the stage for this discussion, obviously we all remember that on the 13th of June, Israel launched an unprovoked surprise attack on Iran, catching the Iranians and indeed much of the world off guard, hitting the country's nuclear facilities, assassinating top military officials and scientists and others. After Iran eventually recovered, it retaliated with waves of ballistic missiles against Israel, many of which were intercepted, but many of which got through in an unprecedented way and did substantial damage to major Israeli urban centers, military targets, military headquarters, intelligence headquarters, and so on and so forth. And it quickly turned into a brief war of attrition as both sides continued to hit the other. While the U.S. initially distanced itself from the Israeli attack in the immediate aftermath, I think once Trump saw that there was some success on the Israeli side, he sort of tried to take some credit for it. It talked about coordinating with the Israelis and even almost running interference using the negotiations to allow Israel the element of surprise. And eventually, obviously, Trump involved the U.S. military directly by launching a major operation against Iran's nuclear facilities, which led Iran to retaliate against the Al-Udeid air base in Qatar, which was followed by a rapid diplomatic process and a ceasefire, which is held until today. Iran's Islamic Republic remains intact, despite what many believe to be an attempt to kind of provoke a regime collapse there. And despite proclamations by Donald Trump that Iran's nuclear program was totally obliterated, the real outcome remains unknown. In addition to the fate of the deep underground facilities that Iran had, Iran reportedly moved large quantities of uranium out of those facilities in the days before Israel's attack. It has since suspended its cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency and has gone dark on its program and enrichment. So I think we'll start there with Rashid. I'll come to you first, if you don't mind. I was hoping you could start us off by, further setting the scene, if you will. You recently wrote an article for Afkar, which is a publication I edit, describing the point of view of Qataris during the attack on Al-Udeid, the extreme seriousness of it from a Qatari and a broader Khaliji perspective, which I think ran a little bit counter to the kind of dominant global narrative out there, which sort of downplayed the attack and described it as a symbolic move by Iran against a U.S. airbase. The Gulf states have obviously been kind of coping with the threat of an Iranian ballistic missile strike for many years. There has been some activity from other places, from Yemen and from Iraq, but this was the first kind of direct assault across the narrow Gulf waterway. Clearly Qatar's air defense systems were able to intercept that. But how vulnerable are Qatar and its neighbors feeling at this moment? Can you help put our viewers who are not based in Qatar in the shoes of Qataris or residents of Qatar, and describe what this unprecedented event was like on the ground, and what you think the implications are for the country and for the GCC region at large?
So, Omar, thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are in the globe. As you mentioned, I wrote an Afkar article on this about a week after the event. The first objective of my presentation today is to unpack. 12 days of warring is a very packed and congested series of events. So it's important for us to unpack what happened. So as we know, Israel started the war with a preemptive strike on Iranian targets, attempting to conduct a decapitation attack, similar to what they did with Hezbollah, in addition to attacking some military capabilities from outside and within Iran. The outcome of that can be debated because Iran was able very rapidly to refill the leadership positions and conduct operations striking Israel. So the main questions I'd like to address in the discussion today is questions of strategic decision making. So like you said, some analysts have brushed over what happened in the last few days, especially toward the end, and especially the attack on Qatar. And it's honestly a shame seeing some analysts quote Donald Trump and take him literally what he's saying, especially about we called the Iranians or they called us, and it's 1 p.m. I'd like to share that from a military analysis point of view, this is not theater. This was a real attack on Qatar. And to discuss this and to unpack it, it's important to look at two aspects. One is capability and one is intent. And this is what we usually look at, especially in intelligence studies. So from a capability point of view, let us analyze Iranian strike capabilities. During the beginning of the war, the Iranians were conducting about 100 to 150 missile launches per day. The Israelis started with 8% penetration rate. At the end, it reached about 16%, which aligns with what you were saying. So, through the war, Israeli air defense became less and less effective. This can be due to better targeting from the Iranians, or the Israelis just not having enough interceptors, and then they have to decide and do a cost-benefit analysis on what to intercept. Towards the end of the war, and this is very important, the Iranians could only do about 20 launches per day. And this is because during the 12 days, the Israelis decimated Iranian launch capabilities and command and control nodes. So the attack on Qatar had 19 missiles. So at that date, 19 missiles was most likely the maximum amount of missiles the Iranians could actually throw at Qatar. So this shows both capability and intent. So the attack was real. And in defense studies, we have BDA, which is battle damage assessment. And usually it happens after the event. Looking at the targeting, one missile went through. It hit a target in Al-Udeid, a radome used for satellite control and communication. So it shows that the Iranians really did their homework when it comes to targeting. Hitting a runway or a hangar can be fixed very quickly. Hitting high-value targets like this show that there was real intent to do, at least military level of damage. Another angle we need to look at, for anybody who's been to Qatar, Qatar is a very congested country, It's a small country, congested airspace, and there was a high chance of collateral damage, which, alhamdulillah, didn't happen. So just to close the loop on this, it was a real attack. Alhamdulillah, Qatar, during the last 10 years, worked on their modernization. So from 2014 until today, the Qatar Armed Forces went through a big modernization overhaul. So imagining the same attack happening in 2014, we would imagine much more damage than expected. And imagining this attack happening a couple of weeks earlier, where Iran could actually throw 100 to 150 missiles, also it would have been a different story. So I'll stop at that, and then later on we can discuss more on Gulf defense and security integration.
Thanks for adding that military analysis. I think that's not something I'm capable of. So that's, I think, hugely important in terms of understanding and also how the war evolved. And so maybe Iran's capabilities at that point, when it struck Oded, were not as strong as maybe in the beginning. And I think it is important because that communication site that you mentioned wasn't part of the kind of early reporting analysis. So that came later, understanding that it was a targeted and a real strike. Um, Daniel, let me turn to you. You're based in Washington. You have your finger on the pulse of U.S. GCC relations, let's say. This war came as a surprise to a lot of people. Donald Trump had indicated that he preferred diplomacy to a military option in terms of dealing with Iran's nuclear program. And yet it appears that at the crucial moment, he didn't say no to the Israelis starting this war, even while negotiations were ongoing between the Trump administration and Tehran. And then he went a step further and escalated by ordering the U.S. military to carry out that massive operation against Iran's nuclear facilities. And while that ultimately didn't lead to the kind of wider war that people had feared, it very easily could have. If Iran had continued up the escalatory ladder and taken the rest of the region along with it, given that there's American military bases spread throughout the region, and those would have been Iran's targets, as we saw on a limited basis. So, Qatar, what impact do you think this episode has had on Gulf-U.S. relations, if any? And what do you think the perception is of Trump in Gulf capitals at this point? I mean, where would you put the trust level at this moment, given the kind of brinksmanship game he played with their security?
Thank you, Amar, for having me today, and I'm happy to be here with my colleagues at the council. Um, Good questions, Amar. Very interesting time, I think, for U.S. Gulf relations. If I could take you back to Trump's visit to the Gulf in May, it was quite interesting the way he postured himself and his policy. And I think he used kind of from the war is deception sort of playbook and how he moved forward and the type of language he used, trying to show a wedge between Israel and the US. And so it was a little bit misleading to what was the outcome of the 12-day war and then, the US strikes. However, uh, given all of that, I still think the US GCC partnership survived that 12-day war and in some ways could be strengthened in some areas in terms of maybe missile defense and even ceasefire diplomacy. And to take it a step back, I know Trump is not a very popular figure, but he's certainly not someone looking for a war. He tries as much as he can to avoid getting involved in wars, and he's very risk averse. I would say if you had President Bush in that position, you probably would have had a very different outcome. However, hard lessons were learned from the Gulf states' perspective. Obviously, the Gulf states will not just automatically support U.S. military action against Iran because the risks are very high. And, I think there was a lesson learned that the U.S. Will act in Israel's interest, even if it puts the Gulf states at risk. So I think when you look at Israel versus the Gulf states, I mean, Israel wins in Washington. So I think looking ahead, you will see that the GCC will demand a larger role in the Iran policy discussions. I mean, just as when the JCPOA agreement happened between the Obama administration and Iran, many of the Gulf states were very upset about that and kind of pushed for more engagement on Iran policy and more engagement on a deal once Trump withdrew, even though all Gulf states were not on board for that. So I think there needs to be a restore of trust through coordination and restraint, and that just as Trump, I think, did collaborate with the Gulf states when he withdrew in some of the Gulf states, I would namely Saudi and the UAE, when he withdrew from the JCPOA. I think they're going to push for the same thing here, that there's going to be coordination in terms of what is the U.S.-Iran policy. But Trump's embrace of Israel's military first strategy really unsettled Gulf leaders who favor a stability first approach. And that has been the Gulf states' approach in the last few years is trying to engage more in diplomacy and in containing threats through engagement rather than through hostility. And so I do think that Trump was viewed in some ways to abandon Gulf priorities in favor of the Israeli military-driven model. And Israel is kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum in terms of how it's engaging the region from the Gulf states. And so to take a step back to talk about the U.S. unilateral strike on Iran, which triggered the retaliation on Qatar, I think that was a major shock, as my colleague outlined. It was viewed to be a strategic contradiction, especially that Trump has all of these massive investment deals in the Gulf, and then went around and kind of caused more risk for these deals. There's going to be discussions about that. And I will say there was a lot of concern about that as well. But I will say, Trump being a businessman, he does not want war or escalation. Let's make that very clear. And he already has investments throughout the Gulf states. So he knows that even his own investments would be at risk beyond the U.S. Gulf investment agreements. I think moving forward, the GCC will emphasize on the U.S. not to act unilaterally in their own neighborhood, and also that security is on the line for them. And it shows that U.S. policy and even Israeli policy can really cause insecurity for the Gulf states. So they will ask for advanced consultations before escalation, U.S. guarantees to protect the Gulf states from Italian retaliation, and linking investment cooperation to stability commitments. I think that's something that I think would be brought up. And new coordination protocols to avoid any strategic surprises. And I will say, going back to that, when the U.S. Did strike Iran, the U.S. purposely did not strike Iran from the Gulf. And Iran has put a criteria forward. They said that if the U.S. was going to strike from the Gulf, that Iran would strike the Gulf back. But Iran broke that criteria and struck the Gulf. And so the U.S. did try to avoid it coming back to the Gulf. So I don't know if Iran had much of a choice, and it was in a corner, I would say. But at the same time, I would have to say Iran's tack was really more of an off-ramp, face-saving one rather than one intended for harm. And the reason being is, I mean, you saw the amount of damage that happened in Israel. Iran could have wreaked havoc throughout the Gulf and even in the bases, and they are able. It showed that their missiles were able to infiltrate missile defense system. And the U.S. did coordinate with Qatar with regards to the Patriot system to try to avert any Iranian missiles. So in the grand perspective, I mean, I think the U.S. did take some sort of measures to avoid, escalation within the Gulf. But overall, I still think that the Gulf states were very unhappy, and I think there's going to be serious conversations about how to move forward. I think moving forward, they're going to look at integrated deterrence. They're not going to break from Washington, but they're going to avoid vulnerability. This is something actually the U.S. has been pushing for, is for an integrated defense system, probably for different interests than just what the Gulf states are interested in. But I would say that that is something they align with, and the U.S. would move swiftly to push forward to more integration in the GCC. And as we've seen, every time Iran has escalated, the GCC states have united, and even the GCC as an institution was created in response to the Iranian revolution. So we're definitely going to see a more united GCC moving forward and a more integrated defense posture moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, that was there was a lot there that I would love to follow up on and unpack. And if you don't mind, I would love to follow up on one thing you said in particular. I mean, you mentioned that the Gulf coordinated with Trump the first time around, or a couple of states, let's say the UAE and Saudi Arabia, on pulling out of the JCPOA. But on that particular issue, those states and Israel were aligned, I think, on maligning the JCPOA. You've talked about, Israel winning in Washington. So now we see a divergence of views. You said that, especially on Iran at the moment and on the Gulf and on the region, the Gulf states and Israel are not aligned, and that Israel wins in Washington. So you brought up really good points, I think, in terms of what the Gulf states will be asking the Trump administration. But I mean, do you see them winning on those issues in the future if Israel opposes them? I mean, the Gulf states seem to have more leverage with Trump than with other presidents, given the kind of transactionalism of Trump and their willingness to work with him. Obviously, we saw what happened during his visit. I mean, how do you kind of situate those things when they're not aligning in Washington? I mean, how much influence might the Gulf states have?
Well, look,
Tough
I mean,
question.
overall, generally speaking, Israel gets its way in Washington because Israeli officials, Israeli policy have been very much aligned. And if you look at even the national security strategies of the US, I mean, what kind of terminology do they use when they talk about Israel? They say it's an ironclad alliance. And, in the recent national security strategies, the Gulf states are not even mentioned. Great power competition is really mentioned. So I think hands down, Israel, has an advantage when it comes to U.S. policy. But there is something where the U.S. and Israel diverge on, and it's about going into war. The U.S. is not willing to go into a full-fledged war in the region, and you see this both on the left and on the right, and so that is a wedge between Israel and the U.S. that I think is in the interest of the Gulf states.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing a wedge or fissures happen especially on the MAGA movement over this issue and over that strike on Iran. Shulub, let me please turn to you. Obviously, you've been producing scholarly work on the Arab-Iranian relationship for many years. How do you assess the state of relations, both in the wake of this war, including the attack on Qatari soil, as well as in the context of the past 22 months, in Iran and the kind of the larger axis of resistance confrontation with Israel? I mean, there was a long period in which there was a lot of trepidation in some corners of the region over Iran's regional activity. And then in 2022, we started seeing a period of rapprochement, first with the UAE, then with Saudi Arabia. And then October 7th happened. So where are we now in that context and in the context of this most recent escalation? You're muted. You're muted.
Okay. Thank you so much, Omar. Let me start my intervention by bringing some figures that will help us to understand how much the situation since 7th of October has become more critical, and I would say more dangerous to the stability and security to the Arabs, Iranians, and Turkey. Since 1948 to 2025, Israel had initiated 13 wars or military operations. Since 2023 to 2025, Israel has initiated 24 military operations. The first number was on the neighboring countries like Egypt, Syria, Lebanon. The 24 since 23 until today, including the one now going on in Damascus, they were initiated on neighboring countries and Iran and Yemen. Why I'm starting with these numbers? There is a huge dynamic and change change is going on and evolving when it comes to the Israel in the region, which have impacted the Arab-Iranian relations. I would argue that the time since 7th of October until today, I would call it the Israeli moment. Why? Israel has presented itself as a victim of the world. And that victimization has justified every action, every military operation Israel has initiated, including the war with Iran started on April 24, because the war has not started on 13th of June of June 2025. It started actually on April 24th, 2024. And I think the continuation of aggressions and attacks from Israel towards Iran was a golden opportunity to Netanyahu and right-wing government to continue what I call it to-do checklist that Netanyahu brought out of his desk on 7th of October afternoon and said, okay, this is the list of to-do. We have to start it. And they start with Gaza, moving to Lebanon, and then Syria, Yemen, and ending with Iran. Now, how all of this influencing Arab-Iranian relations? The Arab-Iranian relations since the Islamic Republic started was always influenced by dynamics around them. There is no serious, I would say, issues influence the relation between them, but more influenced by the dynamics around them. And this you can mention the Palestinian cause. You can talk about minorities, Shia minorities, and other issues. Now, the new matter recently, since 7th of October, is that Iran was surprised with 7th of October, as it was surprised with Arab uprising. And Iran, by nature, does hate surprises in politics. Iran wants to initiate, loves to initiate, but hates surprises. Surprises force Iran to change dynamics and basically put its interest at risk. And that's what happened post-Arab uprising and post-7th of October. Post-7th of October, the file of regional influence of Iran has been opened by the Israelis with a stick in hand that no way that status quo could continue, and they started by using the military actions against what they call it Iranian presence in the region. The last chapter we witnessed, which I think there is one now going on in Syria actually, the last one we witnessed directly between Israel and Iran, which in June, which lasts for 11 days. To me, it's 10 days war, not as Trump says 12 days. It started 13th of June and finished actually 23rd of June. So it's around 10 days. So these 10 days war has brought three main elements to the ongoing instability in the region. The first one has confirmed that the I would say the lack of a trust between Israel and Iran is serious. It's not a joke, because there was a lot of doubts about, no, they are not serious, Let's not forget, in 1978, Ishaq Rabin said Iran the best strategic, I would say, ally in the region. But Israel has changed. Actually, what happened in June since 2024 has confirmed that they are an enemy in reality. In one word, they are enemies. Number two, it has confirmed also that Israel is very serious when it comes to regime change in Iran. And they wish to, they plan to change the regime if they could, and or take the regime to the same scenario Iraq was taken in 1991, when there was Safwan agreement on the southern of Iraq after the forcing Iraq to leave Kuwait. At that time, Iraq has been entered the tunnel of failed state ended by the falling of Saddam Hussein in 1923. That scenario was on the table when it comes to Iran this time. But because Trump is not serious to continue a war, it seems to me that scenario was not, Netanyahu was not able to achieve it completely. And the third element also that war brought is that the neighboring of Iran are threatened more if such, I would say, military action continues. And there is no player or one country can say, I'm safe. Why I'm saying this? Because all of the experts, we expected that Iran will respond. But no one can say that I predicted that Al-Udeid will be number one. We were saying that Iran will target a major military base. But always we did not expect for a political calculations. But when it comes to the decision-making of Iran, I'm here talking about more information. When it comes to that, Iran has realized that they have to think of the target far away from the political calculation. And I think that will make them pay a price for that, when it comes to the bilateral relation with Qatar. Because the military institution, the security institution, and I think they also took the political body to the point that we need to hit a target that may cause pain to the Americans, or at least when you say you hit it, it's an important thing. Regardless what will be the outcome, it's about showing the abilities and showing also a message to the Arab Gulf state that involvement with the United States in any capacity will not bring security. So you need to push more to convince the Americans not to do or to follow up on such a war. Because to the Iranian mindset, this war without the United States will not last. Without a green light, will not be able, Netanyahu will not be able to do all of this. So to do so, they have to attack the Americans and say to them, don't do it. And if you do it, not only you will be at risk, but also your allies, even if our bilateral relation will be influenced. And I think from our political perspective, this is a miscalculation, because I think there is no interest for Iran to lose a partner, a friend like Qatar. That is sort of a crazy decision. And I'm sure that Qatari decision maker will not, forget what happened easily. And I'm expecting there will be a ramification on the bilateral relation to appear gradually. Finally, we have to remember that the dynamic within Arab-Iranian relations, within Gulf Iranian relations, is likely to be influenced of what happened now by the Israelis. Israelis are trying to set the mood in the region. And I think of what's happening today in Syria by attacking the president's, the palace and the Minister of Defense, they are continuing on changing the game in the region. And I think Gulf states are at the center of all of that. Because, for example, just I finish with that, they supported the new regime, the new government, the new political system in Syria. And by attacking it, it will be an indirect message to them that, even this, I'm not happy with that. And that may raise an important question for how long Gulf states can accept these games played by the Israelis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. I'm going to follow up with you. I just want to remind the audience, please submit questions in the Q&A below that we can ask to our panelists. I just wanted to ask kind of a pointed question. I mean, I agree with you that the attack on Qatar was a message to the United States, of course, and also, a subtle message to the Gulf states as well. And you described that as a political miscalculation. and that there will be ramifications for it. I mean, what type of ramifications do you see in the bilateral relationship? I just want to step back for a second. I mean, I saw over October 7th, at least in my eyes, and correct me if I'm wrong from your point of view, but that we were seeing, a consolidation actually of the rapprochement that happened after 2022. That I think the kind of relationship between Iran and the Gulf states seemed to be getting tighter and stronger after October 7th. And then this happened. So, I mean, what are the kind of, maybe I'm wrong in that, you let me know, but, and what are the kind of ramifications of this attack? I mean, as quickly as you can.
Well, I can mention one point. Iran always enjoy the fact that they have different connection to the world through Gulf states. They have Oman, they have Qatar, and that kind of diversification that makes them relax. That we have options. If Qatar decided to take out its role of mediation back and said, look, you have an important mediator, our brother Oman. You have started with that with that in pre-2020, 2015, the deal 2015, and Oman played over. So we believe that you have to continue with Oman. That could be a strong message to Iran that we don't need to play a role of mediator in any file you are part of. That could be a dual message actually for both, for the Americans and the Israelis, because actually Qatar, to me, Qatar also maybe blames the Americans, because the Americans, by allowing Netanyahu to take the region without controlling him, basically they are creating a chaotic situation that affects everyone. So I think that could be a strong message to both sides and saying, look, actually, we are not happy from both sides. And we think, our mediation role is enough to play in Gaza, and then, America, Iran, that could be played by Oman. I think that would be very upsetting to the Iranians.
I think those are excellent points. I mean, I think there is a good deal of reliance on Gulf diplomacy by Iran, not having many outlets, and to suffer maybe a loss of that to some degree at least, which would be big for Iran. Rashid, let me turn back to you. And maybe stay kind of similar to what we're talking about in terms of ramifications. Although there is a ceasefire in place and it's holding, I'm personally not convinced that the war between Israel and Iran is over. Nothing was really accomplished, although we don't know, again, the fate of Iran's nuclear program. But none of the underlying really issues that I think drove these two sides to war was really addressed. And Israel's defense minister said today, he said, Israel will not allow Iran to rebuild its nuclear or its missile arsenal. And I obviously don't think Iran is going to comply with that from its own security standpoint. So you see the potential for this to be maybe an opening salvo in a much larger war. I don't know if it goes back to shadow or it stays out in the open now that it's gotten to this point. But the Gulf states are obviously needing to recalibrate maybe their security. So I wanted to ask you, GCC integration, it goes back decades, but it's never been fully realized. I mean, how are Gulf states thinking about their collective security in this moment? Is there a greater political will for integration now? And what would that look like in practice?
So thank you, Omar. Before I answer that, I want to go just a few steps back. One of the points mentioned by my co-panelist Dania about the missile strike on Qatar, about it could have been much worse. I just wanted to reiterate one point, that when Iran on the 23rd of June launched 19 missiles, most likely that was the most amount of missiles they could launch on a single day, because 2 days before they only launched 20 missiles on Israel. So just a point. And then regarding post-strike decision-making in Qatar, I agree with Dr. Zuwairi's points about ramifications coming in the future and not suddenly. Qatar had two choices. One was retaliation, and from a defense point of view, that was important because you need to reestablish a credible deterrence. The second choice was what I call opportunity capture. So Qatar saw an opportunity to play a bigger role in the current conflict, and it did, which was the right, strategically the right thing to do. But it does open a question about the, Gulf and Qatar deterrence toward Iranian potential future Iranian aggression. Some reflections, and this is something we've been noticing, the decision-making modes of states. I do see that there is a return of what we call strategic culture in decision-making. So usually when we look at states and see, okay, why did Israel attack Iran? Does it match what we call rational actor models? No, because what Israel did was irrational. Iranians attacking Qatar, is that rational? No, and it's similar to what Dr. Zuhairi mentioned. It comes back to strategic culture. The military circles in Iran decided, because it was a military target, and there was a lot of maybe addition to the point. There was a lot of potential cookie points internally. And another thing I see is a return of Cold War dynamics. Even though the trend now is we're in a multipolar world, it feels like we're in a bipolar world. Honestly, we have the axis of resistance, and then we have people against the axis of resistance, mostly the West and the US, and then we have the non-aligned movements like the Gulf and other states. So that's just a segue. In terms of the future of Gulf security, like Dr. Dania mentioned, the GCC was established to address security needs after the Iraq-Iran war. We have three tangible outcomes of that. One is the establishment of the Peninsular Shield, which until now is just a land army. It doesn't have any components for air and navy, as far as I know. Another thing, we have the Gulf Defense Pact of 2000, which is similar to the NATO Article 5. An attack on one is attack on all. So that's from the policy point of view. And recently, last year, we had the Gulf Joint Security Vision, which illustrates some of the threats and the principles. But honestly, this is not enough. With what we're seeing, we don't have only. So I always say we have two destabilizing actors in the region, and they're Iran and Israel. Their actions have introduced a lot of instability in the region. And the only solution I see is to develop a security architecture with the Gulf in the center. And the only way to achieve that is for the Gulf to have a credible defense and security capability. And to do that, we need to see more integration. Are we looking at a European army like Macron is aiming at? No, it's not feasible. And honestly, I don't think it's possible in at least the short and medium term. But what the Gulf can do is empower the existing structures through the GCC, and namely the Peninsular Shield. Introducing air and naval capabilities in that would up the game and increase the deterrence value. It's a long way, and it needs a lot of political will. And I think with the recent developments, and especially the strike on Qatar, and the consequent visit of the president of the UAE, we're seeing more Gulf collaboration and consolidation. So hopefully that will push towards more defense and security integration. It's a little bit of wishful thinking, but usually when the Gulf faces security and defense threats, they consolidate, very quickly.
I think war, especially existential war, is always a good catalyst for some type of change. I mean, given how much these countries spend on their militaries, I mean, do you see the type of appetite for maybe an introduction of air and naval integration capacities into the kind of GCC shield, as you mentioned? And I mean, are the countries, capable of coordinating to that level? I know there's some frictions between them at times, some rivalries between them at times. Do you think, they could do what NATO does, or what?
So that's a good question. I think people would be surprised how much Gulf defense and security integration there is now, because of some of the political issues we faced in the last decade. So there is some integration. There is synergies in terms of assets. We all use mostly Western equipment. So integration, interoperability technically is possible. Knowing defense officials in the GCC, I see there's a lot of appetite. I don't think it needed a ballistic missile attack on Qatar for us to realize. They already realized. But I think what happened now will act as a catalyst. So rather than seeing more integration in the next decade, we might see more integration in the next few years.
Great, thank you. Daniel, Rashid said, there's two destabilizing actors in the region, Iran and Israel. I want to kind of explore a little bit Gulf threat perceptions of these two countries. It seemed like for quite a while, and I mentioned the trepidation in some corners of the region towards Iran. I mean, do you think perceptions of Iran have changed, have stayed the same, have grown worse? Or are the Gulf states concerned with the power and reach and behavior of Israel more? I mean, you mentioned some of that already, which is acting, it seems like, with no red lines. It's Zuhairi said the same thing, that there was wars against Israel's neighbors in the past, and now we have as many actions in only a few years in a much further field. So there's kind of an unrestrained, seems like Israel emerged from October 7th seeking both a restoration of deterrence in the region, but really, I mean, once its enemies started getting pushed back, it seemed like now we're getting to the point of kind of a regional hegemonic ambition here to dominate the region. And as we saw, and one thing, an article I read actually during the war with Iran, it said, Israel's next real enemy is Qatar. After Iran is Qatar. So you're seeing, like, it's just, okay, we've dealt with this guy, who's the next one on the list? And it could be, for any reason, maybe not even just, you're not joining the Abraham Accord. So you're viewed as the kind of rogue actor, the threat. I mean, where do the Gulf states stand on this issue of threat perception between these two regional powers?
Very good question, Amar. So I will address that. I just want to go back to one point that Rashid made about the missiles. I don't think it's necessarily the number of missiles is the only thing to take into consideration. I think how fast they launch and how hard are they to detect. So, Iran did not use its most potent missiles when it struck Qatar. Now, that doesn't mean that what happened should be dismissed or it wasn't a threat to Qatar or a major escalation. But I'm just saying there are other missiles that Iran has used that can be more potent and harder to detect. Moving along to your question, Ahmad. So yes, the GCC's twin security challenges are what to do with Iran and Israel. Really, this last round of conflict marked a watershed moment for Gulf security and diplomacy, as my colleague Rashid and Dr. Mahjoub mentioned. And the GCC had to confront some hard truths about Tehran's aggression and Tel Aviv's impulsiveness. With Iran, the Gulf is really trying to balance its diplomacy, its collective defense, and trying to have some sort of conditional engagement. But they're still trying to contain Iran through engagement. So it's really, their approach is now guided with more through realism, through unity, through deterrence. While their engagement with Israel is quite different. It's defined by conditional normalization on resolving the Palestinian issue once and for all, which is very ambitious, caution, and very high skepticism about Israel's regional role. So all of this kind of points to the Gulf needs to be a little bit more self-reliant and diplomatically assertive. And as my colleagues have mentioned, more strategically cohesive, which is something important for the GCC collectively. But let me get to your question in terms of the threat perceptions of Iran and Israel. So the threat perceptions of both of them are quite different, but very concerning from the perspective of the Gulf states. First, if you go back to Iran, when it had its full-fledged axis of resistance, it was viewed at that point as both a regional security risk and a risk for state-to-state conflict. But after Israel degraded Hezbollah in the Levant, Iran is now more viewed as a risk from state-to-state conflict risk rather than a full-fledged regional risk. And I think that's important to note. For Israel, Israel is viewed from the GCC perspective as more of a regional security risk rather than a risk for state-to-state conflict. Because we know that both the GCC and Israel are U.S. allies, although I did underscore that, Israel is a closer ally to the U.S. And so therefore, there's no fear of Israel striking the GCC, but there is a fear of Iran doing so. I mean, that's the hard facts. So therefore, the GCC states they want to distance themselves from Israel, and they want to contain Iran through engagement, because the risk for them with a direct threat from Iran is much higher. Although Israel's regional policy has caused that threat to increase. So it's a very interesting balancing act. Now, in terms of Iran, the GCC trust is really shattered. So, over the course of the last couple of years, they've had confidence building measures, and Iran did help Qatar when Qatar was blockaded. And I think that kind of honeymoon phase with Iran is over, and now we're going into a phase of realpolitik, if you will. So Iran's decision recently revealed that it's going to prioritize regime survival over GCC security. And so if you put Iran in that situation, then you have a very insecure situation in the Gulf states. And as we mentioned, that Iran's missile strike on Qatar really violated and collapsed trust, especially for Qatar. I thought that was a very interesting selection. I know that Al Udeid is there and it's the most important US base, but honestly, I was surprised that Bahrain was not the main target. But again, when I talk to military experts, which I'm not a military expert, when I talk to them, they say that it's the type of assets and hard assets that are available in Qatar versus the type of military assets that are in Bahrain, mainly through naval ship presence and whatnot. So the selection of Qatar, I think they thought maybe they'd be forgiven. I think that Saudi and UAE would have likely been much more hard in their stance back on Iran, and UAE has a lot of economic engagement with Iran, and I think that makes it more difficult. But it was very interesting how they selected Qatar, because Qatar has the most amicable relations and shares the gas field with Iran. So that was interesting. From Israel, I mean, Israel went from talks on regional integration, as they coin it, to being viewed as almost a regional pariah over the course of the last couple of years. Israel's unilateral strikes on Iran endangered the Gulf. As I mentioned, there were airspace closures throughout the Gulf. There was public panic throughout the Gulf. I mean, people were running to groceries. People were freaking out in Kuwait and in Bahrain. So this was not something that is taken very lightly. And so despite the prior momentum for Saudi-Israeli normalization, Israel's conduct after October 7th suspended all talks at this point and has soured public opinion, I think is an understatement, of how the public in the Gulf view Israel and any engagement with Israel. So I think, like I mentioned to you,
that was a very insightful. Yeah, that was a very insightful answer. I hate to cut you off. I actually want to follow up with stuff, but I don't even think we have time. I want to get to Mahjoub, and there's some great questions in the Q&A at this point that I want to get to. So sorry to cut you off there, but honestly, that was great. Mahjoub, let me reach out to you for another. I actually want to pose some of the same question to you between Iran and Israel, and you answer that, but widen the lens a little bit and bring in, how Iran may move forward in repairing its kind of security and defense architecture in the region, which has been, severely eroded for the past 21 months, including your thoughts on the kind of emerging posture of nuclear ambiguity. I think that Iran is entering into, going dark on some of these things, pushing out the IAEA inspectors, and what that means for the Gulf states and their own regional security and threat perceptions. If you could answer that, and then I want to turn to the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's go back to the point I raised that Iran does hate surprises. Based on that, 7th of October was something Iranians, they never wanted to happen if they have the right to make a decision about it. First of all, Iran feels that since 8th of December 2024, that there was a red card raised on their faces, that they are no longer welcomed in the region. And the withdrawal of 4,000 soldiers by the Russians and taking them back to Iran was a strong message that, you need to think differently about your security and about defining the enemies and defining your network. Iran, since 1989, for the first time, defend its own sovereignty from within its sovereignty. Iran previously used to say, they have Syria, they have Lebanon, they can attack the enemy of Iran. In this war in June 2025, they have to defend themselves from within the border of Iran. That is a major shift on the security doctrine of Iran since the war with Iraq in 1980s. So that's an important issue we need to remember, that Iran basically feels the heat now, that they have to go back within their borders and redefine their security and quickly redefine what are the actions they have to take so they can push back the threat of Israel. All of what they have done so far is showing that they have a capability to harm Israel, and they are not an easy target, but this is not enough. And Iran now is moving toward two main actions. Number one, redefining their network, or rebuilding their relations with the Gulf states. And the statement by Abbas Araghchi just last week that Riyadh is the center of regional decision, that was a very unexpected, to be honest, looking at the history of the relation between the two countries. But let's not forget that the countries, since Chinese mediation, the relation was improved. And even with what happened to Iran and Syria, Arab Gulf states, they tried not to show any kind of, I would say, happiness to what happened to Iran. They were watching what's happening to Iran, but they are not actually showing, okay, that's a great thing to see. And that was the message to Iran, that, we need Iran to play a role, but not the role they used to play. That's number two. Number three, I think that Iran also needs to look internally. There is one thing Iran needs to do quickly, which I call it security reform. If they need to continue as a regime, if they need to survive, they have to fix their security apparatus. And this reminds me, by the way, to what happened to the United States on September 2001. And this also reminds me that the whole incidents, what we are watching since 7th of October, remind me of the war in terror. And I'll come to this quickly. So Iran now needs quickly a security reform so they can create more synergy between their institutions to avoid what happened to them at the morning of 13th of June. When it comes to their relation with the Gulf states, there is no single view, or we can say all Gulf states in one basket. we have different views. And the time where countries they are involved in Abraham Accord, the other countries they are not completely involved. And where our countries they are welcoming Israeli role, Israeli involvement in the security architecture in the region, there are other countries that are not welcoming. So situation, the whole picture has not been finalized yet. So Iran is trying to play on this kind of situation, that as long as the situation has not been finalized, we can play a role to change things so we can gain some of the, I would say, profits of the situation. Because the more there is a delay on Abraham Accord, on normalization with Israel, the more Iran is winning. And based on that, they try to put Israel under to zoom in on Israel and say, Israel actually is destabilizing the region. Israel is doing that. Israel is doing this. By saying that, they're trying to say, actually, not me, the bad guy, is Israel. And that is basically what they did in 1990 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. They did the same. They said to the Arab Gulf states, you were saying in 1980 that I am, speaking of Iran, that I am the threat to your security. Actually, it's not me, it's Iraq. So now they are repeating the same scenario by saying, actually, we are not the threat, it's Israel. I'll just stop here.
Thank you very much, and for keeping that concise. And I agree. I listened to the president of Iran's interview with Tucker Carlson, and he was making the same argument even to the United States, that Israel is the problem, it's not us. They're the kind of threat to regional stability. Yeah. Okay, let me turn to the Q&A. Our first question actually came in from Spain's ambassador to Qatar, His Excellency Alvaro Renedo, and he who was in the country in Doha actually on the day of the Iranian attack. And he said that the situation is still very concerning, fragile, and volatile. And he had a kind of twofold question. How do you foresee the situation may unfold in the near future? And how would the mentioned concept of integrated deterrence work in practice? So I'll say the second question for Rashid, maybe, because that was similar to the questions I was asking you. Does anybody else want to take how the situation may unfold?
I'll take the situation.
Go for it. Quickly, please go for that one, Makshul, first.
Okay, I think I completely agree. The situation is concerning. I think Israelis have no interest to cool down the situation in the region. Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, everything is the region now is relying on what will happen in Gaza and what the Israeli government will do. And no one can deny that the situation is escalating in Gaza. And the more escalation we see in Syria, the more escalation we see on what's so-called the cyber attacks now, which going on between the two countries, Iran and Israel, there will be no security. I think the situation is concerning. I believe the United States has to play a strong role to control what Netanyahu is doing. Netanyahu is escaping from conflict to conflict and leaving the conflicts unresolved. And that is basically increasing the level of instability. And I think the major region which will be impacted by that is Europe. And Europe has, the time has arrived to wake up and play a role, not control and put itself in the hand of the Americans. Europeans are not doing enough to solve the current situation in the region. They are completely following the United States, which does not do anything to control Netanyahu. And this is really concerning about regional security.
I agree, and no one's mentioned obviously the ongoing genocide in Gaza.
Absolutely.
At the heart of the past 21 months of instability and conflict, obviously, that needs to be resolved. Step. Rashid, please, you want to take on the second part quickly?
Of course, very quickly. I might have mispronounced. It's the integrated defense, not integrated deterrence. So integrated deterrence is when you use. No, that was the question from the ambassador. So integrated deterrence is when you use more than one aspect of deterrence, usually nuclear, when you're developing deterrence. Integrated defense is when you have, an integrated defense capabilities with different state actors. And that's what we're pushing for. I didn't mean to check X while in your panel, Omar, but speaking of Israel, just now the Israelis strike the Syrian army HQ in downtown Damascus. So it comes it comes back to Israel as a destabilizing actor.
I mean, there's no question with the presence in Syria, with the presence in Lebanon, with what's going on in Gaza, with what's happening in Iran, Yemen, elsewhere. I mean, it's truly a situation that is very destabilizing to the rest of the region. I think everybody's noticing that. All right, we have a question from Damian Jones. Given the erosion of various components of the axis of resistance, how viable are proxy threats against GCC countries if Israel and the US decide to continue military actions against Iran or overtly seek regime change or regime behavior change? Dania, do you want to answer that one, or we can pass?
I mean, the axis of resistance, if you will, I mean, really the strongholds now, I think, are in Iraq and in Yemen. So really in the Levant, I would say they've been weakened tremendously. So it does kind of put more risk on the Gulf states, but there is a ceasefire agreement in place between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, and I would assume that would expand to the rest of the Gulf states. So there is maybe some risk from Iraq, but I think the most risky situation is with Iran itself and the GCC states, and so containing Iran would be key. And this situation, I will say that from the U.S. perspective, and I'm not taking the card off the table that a war could happen, but the U.S. does not want to have a war with Iran. I mean, after the attack, the awful attack in Qatar that happened, you know, the U.S. did not respond, did not continue, and I think the Gulf states did not want the U.S. to respond as well, because they don't want this to escalate. So I think, you know, Trump's policy was very, in terms of attacking Iran, was very surgical and targeted. But, you know, if it could spiral into a war, and Netanyahu is hell-bent on having some kind of war, and is very maximalist, because now he thinks with Iran down that Israel is, you know, a dominant power aside from Turkey in the region. So it's very concerning on what Netanyahu will do next, because now if you're talking about the axis of resistance, the Israelis are not feeling threatened from the axis in resistance. Maybe the Gulf states are more so. So I think that's very interesting to see and watch how things unfold.
Omar, can I say just a quick comment?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. I think we have to remember that what Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing government is doing should remind all of us of the action of the United States post 9/11. They basically demonized list of people, list of country, list of characters, list. I mean, the way how they act, it's a personal matter. And basically, the more they hit, the more they kill, the more they destroy, the more they you know, act in a genocide manner, the more you know, they can basically impose a new image or show the deter of them. They are still powerful. I think Israel is behaving exactly as the United States did post 9/11. If you go and review it action by action, it's basically they are reviewing the same guideline. And actually, Biden said it in one meeting when he said, Benjamin, don't make the mistake we did. And he was referring to post 9/11 policies that the United States followed. So I think Benjamin Netanyahu, I think he is aware of all of this, and he said it in the first speech on 7th of October. And I think what he's doing on now, going to Syria and hitting Syria today, and God knows where he will go tomorrow, these kind of actions, he want to Israelization of the region. At that time, they want to Americanization of the world. Now he wants us to impose the Israeli strategy, Israeli policies, Israeli strategic thinking on the region. And even if it's a way handing the stick, you have to listen to us, otherwise you will pay the price.
Thank you. We have a few more interesting questions. We have about 4 or 5 minutes, so let's try to keep answers concise. From Bahram Kalviri, we have, how might this incident influence the future footprint and operational posture of U.S. forces in the Gulf region? Are we likely to see a greater dispersal of assets or enhanced defensive capabilities? And there's a second question. What specific changes are anticipated in the military doctrines and defense acquisitions of Gulf states to counter the increased threat of proxy activities, particularly from groups like the Houthis? Rashid, we've lost his video. Do either of you, Daniel or Mahshub, want to answer either of those questions?
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, there's Rashid, we see.
Did
you hear the questions?
I'm in a very secluded part of Europe, so I lost connection for a bit.
Okay.
Okay. The question from Bahram.
Yes.
So we've already seen that. So one of the people keep talking about Al-Udeid was empty when the strike happened. Actually, that's part of U.S. strategy. When there is tension on the coast, the U.S. has an arrangement to actually move a lot of the assets to Saudi. This is short term. Long term, I think it depends on U.S. Threat perception in the South China Sea, because the U.S., even though in the U.S. security strategy, they need to be able to fight two high-intensity wars at a single time. Actually and factually on the ground, the U.S. can't. And it depends on the U.S. threat perception. Do they want to protect the Gulf and keep supporting potentially Israel, or do they want to look at their interest in the South China Sea? They can't do both.
There's a lot of interesting questions there, I guess, because they even have apparently reportedly depleted much of their missile interceptors.
30%.
And it takes a long time to rebuild that, actually. So
30% of the missile interceptors have been depleted, but this is including Ukraine, just to add that context.
Okay. Danielle or Mahshub, do you want to weigh in on either of those questions?
Go, Daniel. Go, Daniel. Go first.
Okay. The U.S. is very fluid in how it brings assets into the Gulf and out of the Gulf. And as you know, if the U.S. senses there's a situation where there's going to be conflagration, the U.S. has put forward different assets into the region. So I think it's very fluid. And I think if there were any more escalation, that the U.S. would certainly put forward more assets and even could be personnel in the region. And also, if they think there's threats, they move out personnel as well, as we've seen in the last iteration. So yeah, I do think it's fluid, and I think the U.S. is still very committed, maybe not in the same way that the Gulf states want the U.S. to be committed. But I don't see any sort of major changes in the U.S. posture in the Gulf that are much different from the last 10 years, let's say.
Great.
I don't think so. I don't think so that the Americans have changed any of their plans when it comes to the Gulf, regardless all of those developments in the region. I think they try to build 2 or 3 bases in Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure about the size of those, but those are something new. I'm not sure if this kind of this decision has to be linked with what happened to Al-Udeid or not, but it's been announced after the Al-Udeid event. I think it's important in the region at the moment to have a political arrangement as a first step. Without a political arrangement and just work on military size, that will not bring stability and peace. We need in the region, and we need partners from Europe in particular, Asia. We need to involve China. We need to involve Japan. We need to involve Russia to have a serious political arrangements that could control what Israel is doing. What Israel is doing is a serious threat, not only to the region, but to the global stability. I think the more the more we talk about only military and capabilities and military arrangements, and we I would say exclude the political arrangement, the more we make a mistake regionally. I think there is a serious need for a political arrangement now, not without any kind of delay.
Thank you, Mahjoub. You had the final word. We've hit the exact time, so we'll leave it there. I want to thank you to our panelists for a truly excellent and insightful conversation. Thank you to our translator for your great work, and thank you to the audience for joining us. Please continue to follow Middle East Council on Global Affairs, our work, our events. We have Afkar, our publication that you can read great analysis on.